First, a few words about the Kurds. I was in the Council of Europe in 2015. I met a young lawyer. I told her that I had been in Diyarbakir the year before, in March 2014. Yeah, I met her in 2015. I was there as well, she said. Oh, it's a pity that we didn't meet, I said, because I found her to be very interesting. We could not have met, she said, because I was in prison. Why were you in prison? Well, when I graduated from law school, I became a member of Öcalan's legal team. And for that, I was imprisoned for 5 years. Her name is Ebru Günay. And tomorrow she comes to Iceland together with Havin Guneser, who is the translator of Öcalan's publications. They will be staying in my house. I am organizing a meeting on the future of the Kurds on Saturday. This is my contribution to cultural diplomacy for the Kurds. It's getting late, and everybody wants to be liberated, I think, I suspect. That's only human. So, what I will do is try to be as short as possible. I have prepared a speech. I will leave that with Mark and try to be brief. I had intended, and I do intend, to make 10 points to be thrown into the discussion. Point number 1. This is a very important discussion. And the information we are receiving is very important to all of us. What we have heard about the Roma and Sinti people is important to me. And your explanations, Professor, are also important. And it's important for all of us to be engaged in the discussion about the future of democracy, because there is reason to be concerned about the future of democracy. That was the first point. Point number 2 has to do with security, global security, or stability. We are in Berlin, and if we look at the world from this standpoint, I think it is safe to say that since the Second World War, the world around us here has been calm and peaceful. I'm not talking about freedoms. I'm not talking about the condition of individuals or groups, or for that matter, nations. I'm talking about stability. Or should we use another term, predictability? Predictability. The world has been predictable. If we enlarge our horizon and look at the whole world, we of course cannot talk about such stability. We had Korea, we had Vietnam, we had Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, Middle East, El Salvador, Nigeria, Ethiopia, Eritrea. The list is long. And here in the vicinity we had the Balkans, of course. But it is safe to say that the world was predictable. And what contributed to this was, of course, the power of the military states, of the strong military states and their alliances. And these structures can be seen in the Organization of World Politics, the Security Council. And in this part of the world, we had the Warsaw Pact and NATO, which ensured this kind of stability, predictability. Point number 3 has also to do with stability, and here I look inwards. Our societies were predictable, and you always had a forum to discuss things. And if things were getting out of hand, the have-nots in society were becoming too many, there was a platform, there was a table to sit down and discuss it. Labor unions, state, municipalities would have a way of finding solutions. And society was aware of this in the same sense as the 19th century European aristocracy, once it discovered that the cholera bacteria did not ask about social class when it selected its victims. So an open sewage system was a concern of all, and the responsibility of all. Of course, there were differences and divergences. How far to go, to what extent apply the principles of Roosevelt's New Deal or Keynesian economics. But there was, to a very large extent, consensus about the basics. In the 1980s, this started to change with the advent of Margaret Thatcher, who, together with determined right-wing politicians, were heeding the advice of Hayek, Friedman, Buchanan, who were revisiting old liberal theory, hence the neoliberalists. So my third point was about political stability based on a widely accepted consensus. Fourth point. This is about progress. I think Europeans, I think to a large extent the entire world, believed in progress. We were moving forward. And progress is very important, objectively, but also subjectively, because it's linked with hope. It's linked with hope. And I, for one, think, even if we have had all, the world's famines, plagues, calamities of various kinds, wars, the 20th century was a century of progress. The fifth point is about hopes people had for globalization. There were many people who believed that we were also in this sphere heading for progress. When we look at the capitalist world, they gathered 44 nations in Bretton Woods in New Hampshire after the war, New Hampshire in the USA, trying to create a new monetary order applying to all these states, individual states, sovereign states. Remember that. They had greater ambitions. They wanted to create what later became the World Trade Organization, but it didn't manage to do that. The American Congress voted that down. But we had this monetary order, and there were many people who thought that this was good news. We got the GATT agreement, General Agreement on Trade and Services, and Trade and Tariffs. and people were discussing how to lower tariffs and open the world and create a marketplace which we all had access to. Again, there were high hopes. The sixth point has to do with democracy and human rights. Global stability based on the power of the strong, the mighty, is not necessarily conducive to more human rights. And we know that the institutions created after the First World War with the advent of the United Nations, like the UN Genocide Convention created in 1948, never came into creation, into practice, I should say, at that time. It was an early victim to the Cold War because the big powers didn't want to be involved themselves. And it took half a century to realize these dreams. Now, but also there was hope here. And there was hope when Kofi Annan was talking about responsibility to protect at the beginning of this century, a principle that is still being developed. Now, my seventh point, I turn to more negative developments. The predictable world of yesterday is no more. It's no more. Faraway wars are certainly at the doorstep of everybody, all mankind. When NATO celebrated its 50th anniversary in 1999 in Washington, and in the years leading to that, there was a change. There was a change in emphasis. How? Formerly, and you could see what I was talking about, the predictability here. Formerly, and if you look at the tractate, it says an attack on one member nation is an attack on all, geographic. The change in emphasis was this: not an attack on a nation, a threat. A threat to any member nation is a threat to all. Who is likely to be most threatened? The most aggressive states? The states wanting the resources of the world and take them with aggression? Aren't they likely to be threatened? And isn't it dangerous to be in such company? I think it's very dangerous. This is why Donald Trump is a concern to all of us. Not only Donald Trump, I could mention other names as well. Now, the eighth point brings me again to the political arena, because this has to do with lack of predictability again. When Margaret Thatcher was asked, what is your greatest achievement in your political life? She answered bluntly, Tony Blair and New Labour. We forced our opponents to change their minds. Biggest achievement. And this is exactly what happened. As we got neoliberals, we now got new labor, not only in Britain, but in most Western European countries. If I recall, Bill Clinton also talked about new democracy. Remember that? But while the neoliberals sought their ideological roots, the neolaborites abandoned theirs. There was talk of a third way. You remember Anthony Giddens with the third way? Many social democrats took this with open arms, but the electorate became perplexed. The German economist Wolfgang Streeck said in an interview published in The Guardian a few months ago that capitalism was broken, and more specifically he said, and I quote, "Modern capitalism has relied on its enemies to wade in with the life belt of reform. During the Great Depression of the 30s, it was Roosevelt's Democrats who rolled out the New Deal, while Britain's Unionists allied with Keynes. Compare that with now. Over 40 years, neoliberal capitalism has destroyed its opposition." Something to think about. So the lifeboat was gone. And with it has also gone the relative stability and predictability my generation, in Western Europe at least, grew up with. And this, the voters have also registered. And then people are surprised. And now for my 9th point, increased misgivings about globalization. We had GATT. Let's cooperate, reduce tariffs. GATT we had from the late 40s until the mid-90s. Then a new institution came to life, the World Trade Organization, with GATS, not GATT, GATS, General Agreement on Trade in Services. And now societies began to look inward. Capitalism must function better. They tried this many times. May Agreement, multilateral agreement on investment, that failed. 1995 they tried, it failed, and they abandoned it in 1998. Why? Because then the public knew what was happening behind locked doors. That's why it failed. When the French discovered that the French government could not have preferential treatment of the French film industry, it had to do the same for Hollywood. They said, what? Can't we decide that ourselves? No, you're in a free market. Away with that. So comes the World Trade Organization along, also in secrecy. You remember the protests in Seattle? And then other places as well? What did they do? They held the next meeting in Doha. Why? There's a lot of sand there, and it's difficult to get there. PSI, Public Services International, with 25 million members, was allowed to have one representative. That's the democratic dimension of this. The European Union started to do the same inward. Society must be organized along market lines. Along market lines. So, trade agreements have turned into an attempt to force feed us with fully fledged capitalism. with all the consequences this entails economically and socially. This indeed has also been the criticism waged against the European Union of late, developing a structure based on market values rather than social values. Here the so-called right wing and the so-called left have all too often been united until Donald Trump and Brexit. Donald Trump and Brexit. And here I come to my final point, namely the arrogance of the institutional world in evaluating political behavior and democratic aspirations, and in their failure to understand why grassroots politics and the traditional institutional political world are drifting apart. I may not agree with the reasons why Trump put a halt to international trade agreements, TISA, and its equivalent across the Pacific, TTIPs, or the ideology of Nigel Farage in the United Kingdom on Brexit, and certainly not with Le Pen, but neither did I agree with the way Obama handled TISA in Congress, nor Macron's anti-trade unionism, nor do I agree with the European Union's emphasis on organizing society with finance and capital interests always in the forefront. This is why many of my kind might have sympathies with Brexit, i.e., as a legitimate protest against these developments. And when we add all this together, the international power blocs consolidating their grip again, which seems to be the case, pursuing anti-social policies, hiding their money in Panama, moneyed people of all political colors included, inequalities in all parts of the world on the increase, and not to forget, the media at large arrogantly giving marks to the population, like a teacher in an unruly class of pupils, saying that the British failed the democratic test, while the French had stood it. Thank God they stood the assaults of populism. We are bound to begin to ponder. To conclude, I say, let us go for some self-examination for the sake of democracy. Democracy is in danger, and it's not only populists, so-called, who are responsible for this, but the institutional world of politics, which has deprived people of what is essential to democracy, the hope, preferably the assuredness that we are steadfastly moving along forward the yardstick of progress. And it is our task to change this. I was going to try to be shorter, but I failed in this. Please forgive me. Thank you.